I want to welcome you all to the Transnational NGO Initiative Student Group, which organizes occasional talks. My name is Costa Bruno van Vijven, and I'm the co-director of the Transnational NGO Initiative. I'm also on the board of ProLiteracy, which is the subject of today's talk. And I'm very happy, let me just introduce David and then make a couple of administrative comments. And then David, you'll have the floor. From there on, we'll be going till 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock we need to stop. David will have a couple of 5-10 minutes to answer any kind of one-on-one questions you might have. But then I have to take him to the Global Collaborative where we're doing an interview with David Harvey, the CEO of ProLiteracy. We'll do 2 interviews with him, which you can find on our websites later. One short interview will be about the issues that David as a CEO has to deal with in ProLiteracy. And the second interview will be done by Matt Whitnell, our graduate assistant here to my left, and he will be focusing more on career-related questions. So be sure to check out those interviews later. We have a whole range of interviews with visiting practitioners from Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and the likes that you might also find interesting to peruse. So today we're talking about how to lead an international as well as domestically operating NGO out of crisis. You did use that word without hesitation.
I just used that to get you in the room.
To get you in the room.
No, we'll talk a little bit about crisis.
We'll talk a little bit about crisis, and we'll certainly talk about significant change.
Yes.
Right? Strategies to reposition an international NGO for success. So ProLiteracy, you may not know this, but there are actually 2 internationally operating NGOs in Syracuse. One is the Near East Foundation that you may have interacted with already.
That's right.
And the other one is ProLiteracy, an adult literacy NGO that has a large domestic program in which it is a membership-based NGO, and David will talk more about the nature of the organization in a moment, where it represents a large group of community-based adult literacy agencies across the US, but it has also a smaller international program. And he'll be talking about an NGO that went through financial as well as programmatic crisis, that still financially is, like most NGOs, is going through a really rough time with the economic crisis. And he'll talk about what defines effective leadership. And he'll share some real-world experience of managing an NGO in an ever more rapidly changing environment. David Harvey is the president and CEO of ProLiteracy. Before he joined ProLiteracy in 2007, he was the founding executive director of the AIDS Alliance for Children, Youth and Families based in Washington, D.C., a national training, research and advocacy organization. So he worked entirely on domestic issues in the AIDS sector and then moved to the adult literacy sector and partially into an international arena. He also was a project director with the National Disability Rights Network, which is a very interesting sector. The disability NGO sector is a very interesting and newer generation sector of NGOs. And he began his career as staff assistant to U.S. Representative Sam Gejdenson.
Yeah, very good.
From a Democrat from Connecticut. And David's very deep knowledge of Capitol Hill and how policies and regulations are made have proven to be very important in launching ProLiteracy's advocacy agenda. So that by introduction, a couple of quick things. The talk is being recorded by ICT and will be on our YouTube channel afterwards. We're also passing a sign-up list. If you are not yet on the TNGO, Transnational NGO listserv, student group listserv, then please put your name on that. And I think that's it. Not any other admin things? No, David, you've got the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. Tosca, thank you for that very nice introduction. What I'd like to say starting out is that I really want this to be a discussion and a talk about the kind of real-world experience of an NGO. I love talking to students like you who are studying and reading and hearing from groups like ours around good governance, effective leadership, and what makes for an effective NGO. You won't hear me actually use a lot of those words. I'm going to be telling you from a very practical perspective about my work leading ProLiteracy and some of the current challenges that we face that I think intersect with certainly your studies, but also as a real living case example of what's happening in the country right now as a nonprofit organization like ours tries to navigate through a very complicated, fast-moving world and a very tough economy for fundraising. So, before I get into kind of an overview of the work of ProLiteracy and a little bit about the issue that we work in, I'll tell you a little bit more about who I am and where I come from. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for about 27 years, straight after graduating from undergrad. And in D.C., after working on the Hill, I went back to graduate school and got a master's in social work. So, I'm not an educator, but I head a national education organization, an international education organization. And although I've been trained as a clinician in adult psychotherapy, I don't practice clinical work. So my background is somewhat maybe unusual and diverse for the position that I currently hold, but one of the things we'll be talking about today and what I will argue is that bringing a very diverse set of interest and experience is what makes for a successful tenure as a CEO of a nonprofit organization. So any broad-based experiences that you can gain as you start out your careers in this area will serve you well later on. I don't know what the current statistics show, but the chances are that many, if not all of you in this room, are going to end up at some point in your career in a senior leadership position or even an executive director, CEO position of a nonprofit group. So one of the things I want to make sure we have time to talk about today is any questions you may have about possible track that you want to pursue in your career and how you work your way toward achieving that position that you're seeking to gain as you go forward in your careers. So without further ado, I'll get into a little bit of the presentation today. Let me also introduce three partners in crime that are here with me today from ProLiteracy. And little do they know, but I may call upon them to answer questions that some of you may have about the work of ProLiteracy. Amy Schmitz is our Director of Communications. Kara Thorick is my assistant and works to staff our Board of Directors and is a very, very important intersection point for the work of our organization. And Robin Smith is our Director of Events and Meeting Planning. So Robin has some lead responsibilities for organizing our training events, our national conferences, and our soon-to-be international conference as well. You ready to go to Medellin, Colombia, Robin? Yes. Okay, first slide. Do I control the slides or? Oh, I have a clicker here. Ah, this one? High tech, okay. Very good. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the issue that we work on, the adult literacy issue in the U.S. and globally, get into organizational stuff around ProLiteracy, and then specifically talk a little bit about a turnaround operation, what it takes to turn around an organization that is struggling. How many people here are studying kind of the whole academic models of a turnaround operation? Have any of you gotten into that type of area of study? Okay, well this will be your first occasion to do that. You notice I put the word crisis up here. The adult literacy crisis is a silent issue in many respects here in the U.S. that does not have great awareness about the causes of this issue and how it intersects with many other social concerns in our country. Here in central New York, there are 140,000 adults over the age of 16 who, in practical words, are functionally illiterate. There are there's an elaborate measuring scheme for how you determine what literacy rate an individual is at. It's basically a scale of 1 to 5. These adults that I am showing some of the statistics up here, function below level 1 or 2 literacy level. And in practical terms, that is functional illiteracy. Basic skills that you and I take for granted are very difficult for these individuals. Reading a newspaper, reading a label in a grocery store, making change, understanding how to use a computer. That is the type of things that we are talking about. And it is a silent issue because of the stigma associated with these issues. Very hard for young people and adults to come forward and talk about the fact that they may be struggling with basic literacy skills for fear of being viewed as stupid or uneducated. So one of the major problems we face in this field is overcoming stigma. We can talk a little bit more about that as we get into this. In the United States today, federal statistics show that of the same categories I was just describing to you on the literacy scale, 30 million adults over the age of 16 struggle with basic literacy skills. Take that statistic in for a minute because it has huge implications for our country. It has huge implications for our ability to compete globally, to meet the demands of a skilled workforce, and to assess how this issue also intersects with many other social problems that in this country today we spend billions of dollars on trying to alleviate and address. Globally, well over 900 million adults are functionally illiterate. These statistics, I will say as a word of caution, have to be taken with a little bit of grain of salt because particularly when you move into the international arena, countries define rates of literacy in very different ways. So the statistical methods used, how do you measure illiteracy in the developing world is a very big problem for institutions like the United Nations and UNESCO to come up with actual accurate measurements about. Improving literacy rates, we argue through the work of our organization, is all about social change. What a lot of the research will show you is that this issue, helping someone to improve their literacy rates, is a means to touching on many other social problems. We know that if literacy skills are improved in an individual, they're going to be able to navigate the healthcare system better. They're going to be able to read a prescription drug label better. They're going to be able to fill out insurance forms. They're going to understand the instructions that nurses, social workers, and doctors give them when they face a health problem. If they don't have literacy skills, chances are today in America that's not going to be identified in the healthcare setting, and you may send a patient away, they haven't comprehended what they're supposed to be doing to take good care of their health, and that ultimately ends up costing the healthcare system a lot of additional money because that patient may come back into the system, they haven't understood something, they may have poisoned themselves or their child by giving incorrect doses of medication. You get my drift. So health literacy, very important issue. Alleviating poverty is an obvious one. If you have basic literacy skills, you're going to be able to get a better job. And today in America, we have a whole class of low-skilled jobs, manufacturing jobs that have been eliminated permanently in this recession. Our programs across the United States are inundated with people coming in who know that they have to, often for the first time in their lives, confront the issue that they cannot fill out a job application, don't know how to use a computer. If you don't gain those basic skills, chances are you're not going to get another job in this economy. It's a huge issue in terms of an intersection between basic literacy instruction and creating a skilled workforce. What do our members do? ProLiteracy is an organization that some might use the word association to define us. The reality is we're a membership organization that works nationally and internationally, and we have, roughly speaking today, across the United States, 1,200 member organizations. These organizations across the United States rely on ProLiteracy for a range of things. Information dissemination, training and technical assistance, a provider of expert resources and training materials. Half of ProLiteracy is a publishing operation, New Readers Press. We publish 150 instructional titles in everything from English as a second language to basic GED instruction, basic reading, writing, and math. And our programs plus other institutions across the country buy these instructional materials from us. It is a key revenue generator for our organization. The cash that comes in off the sales of publications is what keeps us alive every week and every day as we go about our work. It enables us to meet our payroll bill of $140,000 every 2 weeks to support 70 staff positions. And if we didn't have it, I think we'd be a very different organization today. Nonprofits in this country today, many are struggling and learning and wanting to talk about how to create earned income strategies. We're very fortunate in the ProLiteracy in that we've had a publishing operation for 40 years that has generated these types of revenues that support our larger operation. I'll talk a little bit more about how we're structured in a second related to financing. But basically, this is what our member programs do across the United States. We work with specifically community-based organizations. They're independent 501c3 organizations that have been started in local communities and are out every day serving anywhere from as small as 50 to 100 students to well in the thousands. So the size and the breadth of the organizations that are our members vary enormously based on moving across the country. Adult education in the United States as a sector, it basically includes community-based organizations and then adult education programs that are run out of school systems and community colleges. So Onondaga Community College has a very big adult education program that is reaching young people, adults who need access to basic skills around reading, writing, and math in order to complete a GED and then ultimately enroll in college. Our organizations also have a history of working extensively to tap into volunteers. So a lot of our work has been about developing teaching methods and instructional support materials for training volunteers. Nationally today, our programs use well over 250,000 trained volunteers, and in turn they reach many hundreds of thousands of students across the U.S. The adult education system that is based in community colleges and school districts is a little bit different. It's a professional paid instruction system. Students come in for those programs. And the way the client base is divided is that our community-based organizations tend to serve the hardest to reach, the poorest, people who are at the lowest bottoms of earnings, and who often need wraparound social services in addition to what happens in terms of teaching and instruction. We also intersect a lot with immigrants in the United States, legal immigrants who may be studying English to pass a citizenship test or need other basic literacy instruction. In the U.S. today, there are 3 drivers of the adult literacy crisis. One is undiagnosed learning disabilities. 2 is high school dropouts, which in some communities across America is 50% of students dropping out of some inner city high schools. That statistic is shocking, 50% dropout rates. And the third driver of the problem, and this roughly is a third and a third and a third of the population, and the third population, of course, is legal immigrants. And today in America, legal immigrants who are coming to the United States are the least educated, least literate in our nation's history, which again has some profound implications for our economy and for our educational and social sectors. Let me pause there. Anyone want to pose a question about the adult literacy problem in general before I move on to talk about ProLiteracy? Yes?
I'm just wondering, do you have any psychological support to those people? Because, like, well, immigrants, it's
Right.
We cannot like you help them somehow to make this journey easier to understand themselves and.
That's a very good question. So community-based organizations, our membership, I was mentioning that often a component of what they do is social services or wraparound services to basic educational programming. So it is absolutely the case that a lot of people who are coming in the doors are in need of a range of other supports, or they're not going to experience success in the educational program. And that might be mental health care, it might be child care, it might be accessing the healthcare system. Some programs provide some of those services right on site. Many of them, though, develop partnerships with other sectors, with other agencies to make sure that those services are offered in tandem. But one of the issues that this field faces is that it is very resource poor. Adult education and literacy in the United States at the federal level is funded at about $600 million, which is a drop in the bucket. States match those funding levels, and prior to the recession, states on their own put double that amount of funding into this system. Post the recession and the state budget cuts, we've gone way back in terms of what monies are flowing for adult education. And adult education is often the first thing on the chopping block, unfortunately, before the K through 12 system. So this is a very poor network of programs and services in the U.S. And one of our primary goals at ProLiteracy is to try to raise awareness of this problem so that we're allocating more resources to it. As you can imagine, it's a very tough task to do in this recession. So hence, our work has been very much to try to promote partnerships with other agencies. There may not be a direct increase in funding that comes from government or private sources, but what an agency can do is to walk down the street and talk to the community mental health center and come together and do some of those services.
One more question. I thought somebody gave a question about the first part of the presentation.
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I guess, do you guys do any outreach in the public schools for students with learning disabilities who turn 21, are ready to graduate, but still haven't reached a certain threshold with their literacy and ability to read?
Yes. What you'll see in some communities across the country is that there's a partnership that's established between the school system and the community-based organization who sends in tutors and volunteer educators to kind of work one-on-one with students. And learning disabilities is a big area for this, but there's not enough of it. Nowhere near enough of it because, as I mentioned, one of the main drivers of this issue and problem in the U.S. is undiagnosed learning disabilities. So undoubtedly there is a link between undiagnosed learning disabilities and kids who drop out of school. If you're not identifying and getting appropriate educational supports, you'll be less motivated to finish a degree, and so it's one factor that contributes to the dropout rate. Any other questions? Was somebody else raise their hand?
Okay. I just want to say, we can do one or two more questions on the issue, but I do want to make sure we get enough time for David to present on and for us to discuss about
Organization.
NGO as an organization, leadership, crisis, and change. So just
Okay.
make sure we don't get too deep into the nature of the issue that the organization is addressing. Yes.
Okay.
I said one or two more.
Well, that's my question, Oscar. I mean, if 30 million Americans, or people in the Americans in the United States, are functionally illiterate, how come it's not talked about? I mean, we used to have a stigma about HIV and AIDS.
Yes.
But now there's a lot more awareness about that. Why do you think there are these?
Well, you just gave one answer to a question, which is how I got this job. I worked previously in the AIDS community, and I think one of the things that our board of directors assessed was no one knows about this problem. Why is that? What do we need to be doing to raise awareness about this? And so with my experience coming out of a very successful grassroots-led community-based movement in this country around HIV and AIDS, it's had enormous success. Many would argue it's the most successful health advocacy movement in U.S. history. It's now been eclipsed by other issues, with breast cancer probably being the number one. But you know, what was it? What defines the creation and the success of a advocacy movement? And so, with my experience in AIDS, you know, what are the lessons learned that I can bring from that issue to this issue as we try to raise the awareness of it? There's no easy answer to that. Stigma is part of the problem. There's another set of problems related to the education field in general. The need for educational reform in this country, I think as most of you know, is a huge issue of concern. And due to political intransigence, many other factors, the reform that is needed is not happening, I would argue. So we are caught up in a larger sector where there are really profound issues that are not getting addressed. I, of course, have a new appreciation for this coming into this field because I didn't quite know what I was getting into. In some respects in the AIDS community, we were very spoiled in terms of the attention we were able to get around a controversial issue. Controversy is a key aspect of driving a movement and getting attention for your cause, and AIDS was perfect for that. Adult literacy, not so controversial. Everyone agrees it's a problem, but how do you generate energy, forward motion around this issue? We can come back and talk a little bit about that, and I may even pick on Amy to tell you a little bit about our communication strategies as we're trying to raise awareness of this issue. One thing I'll also tell you is that one of the early things that we did to try to start to address this issue is that we went to Dan Maffei, our congressman who lost in the last election, unfortunately. And, but he, after learning about this issue and working with us, agreed to form a caucus in the House of Representatives focused on adult literacy, first ever. And so we're very excited about that, and that caucus in the House of Representatives is really starting to do some things to push some policy proposals so that we're doing some more things. But this is going to be a long haul to turn this issue around.
May I compliment it with something that you and I have often discussed? What has both struck us, and I don't come from the AIDS field, is that there is surprisingly little voice or agency, as we call it in academia, by adult learners about the impact on their lives of when they become fully literate. So there's no mobilization, well, there was, until recently, very little mobilization, very little adult learners speaking up in Congress or in other public fora, and that is partially also because the one side of that delivers adult literacy service, which is the state education departments across the country, they tend to be frank, this is my personal opinion, okay, but they tend to be a little, what would you say? Conservative and kind of looking at those persons as maybe beneficiaries but not as agents of change themselves, rather paternalistic. So they see themselves as providers, and that's what the attention, where should we go, not to those people who actually should stand up and say we need many more resources, this problem is so big, and if we overcome literacy, this has a tremendous impact on my life, but also my family and my community.
One of the key aspects to a successful social movement is consumer empowerment at the core of it. So, what you saw in the AIDS community, what you see in the breast cancer movement, what you see in the disability community, always at the heart of these movements is a very empowered, educated, supported consumer who speaks up about their needs, who is willing to go to Congress and say, we won't settle for anything less than $1 billion in this program. It's those types of things. This field, the adult literacy field, has not had that. And in fact, there is probably a cultural norm in the education field as a whole to not embrace this kind of notion that this is in fact a social movement. We can talk a lot about that, and we can come back if folks are interested in, but this is something that Tosca and I have talked a lot about, and one of the things we're trying to do through ProLiteracy is to raise funds to create what we call an adult learner leadership institute. So essentially it's empowering consumers, the students in our system to get up and tell their stories, because that's what changes people's minds more than what I or the teachers could do in the policy and media arenas.
Ryan, one more question and let's get another run then.
Okay.
I was just going to
I wish we interacted more with the Education for All movement. You're talking about Education for All on the international stage. Yes. Very familiar with some of those actors and leaders in that movement, but we don't really have the resource and haven't had enough time or manpower to kind of engage at that level. But we will be in the future. Right, team? Yes. Right answer, Robin. But Education for All is a very interesting group, advocacy coalition movement to look at in terms of their efforts to, domestically but also internationally, try to influence U.S. foreign aid so that we're investing more in education in the developing world. Okay, so a little bit more about ProLiteracy. We're an unusual organization based here in central New York. As Tosca said in her introduction, there's only 2 groups that do national, international work here. Most organizations like ours are actually in Washington, D.C. because of the nature of our work having to do with advocacy. Working on the national stage, working on the international stage, many organizations like ours decide to base their operations in D.C. Syracuse happens to be 50, 60 years ago where 2 organizations were founded here. One was Lawback Literacy International and the other was Literacy Volunteers of America. Syracuse is a very special geographic area in the history of this issue, some of it associated with the university. But the Lawback family and a woman named Ruth Colvin, who's still very active with us today, she's 95 years old, from Syracuse, founded Literacy Volunteers of America. And so our national group started out here, based here, and since I've joined ProLiteracy, we've been expanding what we're doing in Washington. We have an office there, but we have strategically decided to keep our headquarters here, which we'll talk a little bit more about as an organizational strategy. But we've kept our headquarters here, and we're capitalizing on some unique opportunities we have here in central New York that you wouldn't get in other parts of the country, but we'll talk more about that. I've already gone over how we're a membership organization. On the international side of things, we have a long 50-year history of supporting the creation and financing small, on-the-ground literacy initiatives in the developing world. At certain points in our history, we were engaged in these small partnerships in upwards of 75 countries. Under some of the work that we've done actually with Tosca to take a look at what we're doing internationally, we have shrunk that number greatly. It's going to shrink even more in the future as we retool what we're doing internationally and pursue a slightly new direction where, as opposed to just being a straight funder of programs, we want to work a little bit more collaboratively and more in the sense of having an organization in the developing world being a member of the organization and then supporting their organizational growth. We can talk a little bit more about that too. But today, as of right now, we have 52 partners in 31 developing countries. It's actually a very small component of the organization, and it's a pretty big geographic spread. New Readers Press I've already commented on. That is our publishing operation. All told, there are 70 people who work for our organization. Our budget is about $11 million a year, a little bit more this year because we are moving our headquarters to a new office. But half of that budget is devoted to our publishing operation. Oops. So, I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing to confront the issues that you raised. Our external strategic direction, with the principal goal being of raising awareness about this issue, developing some new partnerships, and trying to get some forward momentum in the policy and political arenas. So stating those 3 goals was a very important internal exercise for our organization, so everybody knew where we were heading, obviously, in a strategic direction. Internally is a very different matter. So first, stating externally where we wanted the organization to go was a very important exercise that we did in the first 6 months that I was with the organization. Internally, what did we need to be thinking about to move our organization and our cause forward to have a much greater impact on this issue? When I joined ProLiteracy in 2007, many would argue, and I would argue this, that it was an organization in crisis, both financially and programmatically. The organization, believe it or not, didn't really understand where it stood financially. We had some problems with our accounting system. And the board of directors didn't understand the true scope of where the organization stood financially. So when I started the organization, I quickly asked myself what I had gotten myself into, and perhaps I was crazy for taking this job. I don't say that anymore. But what we learned in the first couple of months was pretty disturbing stuff. And so one of the questions I'm going to pose to all of you is to hear your ideas or thoughts or questions about how you might handle a situation like this. But in 2007, ProLiteracy had finished the preceding fiscal year with a $1.4 million deficit, roughly. And it was carrying $3.4 million worth of debt. Now, you compare those numbers to the overall size of the budget, and you know you're kind of in trouble. The organization was structured in a very hierarchical manner, all led by white men who were over age 55. And the culture of the place was not unlike, perhaps, the structure that you might see in more of a university setting. Very siloed, with deans sitting at the head of individual schools, and maybe not a lot of interaction or coordination with other divisions. So internally, this very quickly developed into a turnaround operation. Turnaround operations of corporations and nonprofit groups is a whole school of management thought. I'm not going to go into all of the academic frameworks for understanding or thinking about that, other than to kind of acknowledge that these are more from an academic perspective, some of the key things that you think about as you engage in the turnaround of an organization. So first, diagnosing the problems, really figuring out where the organization stood, immediately moving to stabilize the organization. In our case, that meant revamping our financial accounting system, making staffing changes so that we get the right expertise into the organization to manage the finances, and starting to understand what was going on in the other divisions of the organization, so that we could fix issues, bring the organization together, and move us forward in a new way. So restructuring financially, stabilizing ourselves by reducing expenses and eliminating some staff positions. Once we got through those stages, which I would argue is the more easier stage of a turnaround operation, we started focusing in on all of the other things which have to do with implementing new program ideas, monitoring those, and then tweaking things as we go along. So today, 4 years later, we're in a very different position. But in 2007, I would also point to externally, these are the factors that would describe the adult literacy field. As we've already mentioned, a huge lack of awareness of this issue. Federal funding for many programs over the course of a 10 to 15 year history had been eliminated. Very poor compensation levels, resource-starved agencies, poor training provided to those folks who are working on the front lines, a total lack of, I would argue, an effective advocacy strategy at the federal level to try to address these things, to get more money into the field, and a tremendously factionalized field. Still today, within the field of adult education, there's tremendous cultural differences and infighting between the community-based organization sector and the institutional providers. Again, I guess I've already mentioned these. ProLiteracy in 2007. I mentioned what the figures were, the debt we were carrying, if you all can see this. The deficit that had been identified. I didn't know about the deficit before I took the job. And the low morale of staff. Our board of directors really had not been informed in the right way by the previous leadership before I joined about what was going on within the organization. It's basically a recipe for disaster. These are the factors I'd point to today externally. I wanted to draw a comparison for you about some observations about where the field is at in direct relation to some of the changes that we've made internally within the organization. Keeping our eye on the prize, of course. We exist to serve a mission. We exist, we're in business to influence things externally. So as our organization made some very important changes in the past 4 years, there are some direct results of that externally on the field, which is good. So today, in 2012, in the adult literacy field, because of the communication strategies we've been employing, there is the beginnings of some increased awareness of the scope of this problem. In the last 4 years, ProLiteracy has gotten more national coverage in the national media about this issue than we probably ever have in our entire history. So that's an accomplishment. We all know what's going on in the federal budget in terms of cuts and proposed cuts down the road. It is a success that we haven't had any outright cuts yet. Next year may be another matter. We've had an incredible increase in demand for services because of the economy, and our programs are really not able to keep pace with that. And in fact, as we have struggled at the national level, local nonprofit organizations, many of them have had to struggle even more, and unfortunately we've had some closings of programs across the country. State budget cuts I've already identified. Some of the things that we did in Washington was to not only get a caucus formed, but we restructured a national coalition that national groups were members of to work on issues of public policy and advocacy. When you look at the AIDS community, when you look at the breast cancer movement, when you look at the disability community, a key feature of those movements is highly structured, very effective coalitions in Washington that tap into the resources and the power that each organization brings to the table, and then they in turn influence things in Congress. So we have a brand new effort in this area on this issue with a revamped coalition and a House Adult Literacy Caucus. And then I also mentioned this Confantea conference every 12 years. I don't know why it's every 12 years, but the United Nations sponsors an international adult literacy conference where delegations from all the UN countries, member countries, come in and talk about this issue. This conference was held a year and a half ago. So we participated in that conference. There was the first ever civil society NGO meeting associated with that conference. And we had an opportunity to help set some agenda items coming out of that meeting, and that is good stuff. So it's starting to influence things as well on the international stage. So ProLiteracy 2012, this is what I would point to, and to test this out with our staff to see if they have the same observations. But these are some of the things that I would point to in terms of how we have addressed some things internally within the organization. And I would point out that we're still an organization very much in transition. We are still trying to confront internal problems of morale, management, structure, implementation of new program ideas, taking a new idea, moving it forward to implementation in a very short time frame. These are all big challenges for our organization. However, there's some good things to point to. We were carrying $3.4 million of debt. We've reduced that to $1.4 million. That's an accomplishment in this economy. We did it in part by selling a lot of property we owned to Syracuse University. The chancellor has been very good to ProLiteracy. I might also add that 30 years ago, the university donated a whole parcel of land to us that we used to build a series of offices. So we made out pretty good in the deal. So we used some of those proceeds to reduce the debt, obviously, and then we also used it to think about where we were going in terms of relocating our headquarters. We've balanced our budget for 4 years in a row. That's a good thing to do. We've reduced some of the silos in the organization by a couple of strategies: restructuring staff functions, new strategic plan, removal of some senior staff, changing of senior staff roles and responsibilities. We have an active Washington office. We have accomplished getting and securing some new federal grants. Our organization had never received federal grants in our entire history. That's really surprising for organizations like ours. We are entirely privately funded. In this economy, getting federal grants is a really important strategy because the private sector is not expanding their giving. We have a well-established communications track record at this point and have invested a lot in various communication strategies. We have a leaner, meaner staff that I would argue is doing more today than when we had double the staff size 6 years ago. And we have a highly engaged and formed board of directors. One of the key strategies I always try to follow is complete transparency with the board of directors to promote that engagement. And I think it's a key feature of what CEOs need to be doing as they work with their boards of directors. So, having just thrown an awful lot of information at you and highlighted really just some minimum bare bones of what our organization has been through, I think what I do is pose these kind of 3 questions for some discussion, which I think will have us getting a little bit more into what defines effective leadership in the real world of nonprofit organizations in this current economy. It's a tough thing to answer, and it's a moving target. 2, very specific organizational strategies, management strategies. How do you promote staff accountability, but also instill a culture of innovation and get people excited about the work and wanting to take risks and do things and take on new initiatives? How do you do that within an organization? There are no easy answers to this. And then 3, of course, is the big obvious one in this day and age. For an organization that needs a lot more resources than we currently have, how in the heck are you going to raise resources when we're going through the worst recession in American history, which continues to impact nonprofit groups? So these are 3 questions I would pose. Tosca, you might have a suggestion, or you want to add something to this discussion or these questions.
I think your questions are an excellent start. So you may have some additional questions or comments, but maybe also we can make some attempt at maybe providing a few probably very partial responses, and then having you comment on what you think about it as the real leader. Okay, so questions, comments.
I'm going to invite our staff members to contribute to this discussion too, because of course they've been living this every day.
You passed rather quickly over the external objectives of your organization, but I'm not too clear on what your ultimate goal is, because as you say, immigration is constantly fluctuating, your budget is constantly fluctuating. What is this perpetual crisis that you need to continue to address?
That's a good question. Speaks to what our mission really is. I mean, ultimately our goal is to reduce the size of the adult literacy problem in America. To do that, we need many different strategies. We need more money in this field. We need to effect public policy change. And we need to expand services to students. No easy thing to take on. But ultimately, that is what we're trying to do. Those are our external goals. Yes?
As a follow-up to that, when you say reduce the adult literacy problem, especially in America, are you looking at as a proportion of the total population, or are you just looking at raw numbers? We got 30 million people who are adults that can't read. In 10 years, we'd like that to be 20 million.
I would answer both. I mean, we're looking, the proportion, population changes all the time, right? So you have to look at indicators and markers that look at what percentage of the population is impacted by this problem. How is that changing and growing? based on demographic changes, immigration patterns, and size of the population. We are a growing country. So that's part of the equation. But then I also think you have to have a separate goal that we are out to reduce the outright number. 30 million adults in America who are functionally illiterate is an unacceptable number. It's profound implications for our economy and the future of the country. So there's got to be an outright reduction in that problem to have some direct economic consequences.
Just to supplement that, so there's some of you know, and the students in my class know that in the US here, there's a rather influential web-based rating organization called Charity Navigator. If you search any US-founded NGO on their website, on the front, if they have, it's a 1 to 4 star system. If they have 3 stars or 4, they will have it prominently on the website, web homepage. If they have less, then they will not have that. They in their next iteration, they'll be looking when they try to assess from a distance what you do about results, measurement, and public reporting results. They'll be asking that. They'll be looking for what you say about what effect you want to have on, let's say, the proportion of the population that is not literate in absolute or in relative numbers, and whether you then assess your results against that and publicly report on that. So that's something that if your website doesn't say it yet, that probably in the future you might want to include that. And at the size of that problem, you have to be careful that you don't overpromise and then can't fulfill, of course.
True.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful about how much we're going to claim that we can actually solve this problem in the country. Yes.
I was wondering, you had a slide several slides ago about the turnaround operation that you put together, sort of generally outlining that. I was wondering if you could speak more to the development of your strategic plan and how you went about evaluating the existing programs.
Good question. Have you all spent time studying strategic planning processes and all of that? Okay, all right. So you're in a position to comment on what we did, and then we'll have our staff talk a little bit about their participation in this too. So as we thought about revamping a strategic plan, there was a few things that I wanted to do. One, I wanted to get a realistic set of goals and objectives that we could reasonably attain for the organization. The strategic plans for the organization prior to my arrival had been very grandiose, aggressive documents that claimed we were going to solve the world's problems. Not realistic, not grounded in reality. The other objective I had in terms of thinking about a new strategic plan for the organization was that just as important, if not more important, was the process I wanted to establish in engaging staff. If we don't have a lot of buy-in by staff, you're going to have this wonderful, fabulous strategic plan which will sit on a shelf and doesn't have real-life meaning. So it was at a key moment when the organization was still very hierarchically driven. Might be fair to say our line staff didn't feel very empowered or encouraged or listened to in terms of what their ideas, thoughts, fears, concerns were. It was what I call a shuttered work environment, a very closed down system where people didn't feel safe to express their views. Is that fair to say, Robin? You could disagree with me, by the way.
Keep saying yes.
So I wanted to use this strategic planning exercise to do a couple of things. One, to engage our staff and to get people thinking and working in a very different way than what had been happening previously. So we appointed 6 groups of staff, and the rule had to be that they crossed the division. There could be no group of staff members from only one division. They had to cross the divisions of the organization. And that act alone was very radical for this organization, believe it or not. Some people in our program division never spoke to our graphic design person in our New Readers Press division, much less understood what they did on a daily basis. So that was the first thing we did. We started with our line staff. We did not start at the senior staff level. So we started with our line staff, and we had an outside facilitator come in and pose a series of questions to the staff about what they thought the organization should be doing. I mean, a very simple set of questions to get people talking and expressing things. And so we went through that for a couple of months. Staff work groups met, and their task was not only to kind of share their thinking about what they hoped for the organization, but to also identify what questions needed to be addressed by the organization. I think, and I'd be interested to hear from you about what you read in terms of the academic literature in this area, but one of my thoughts was that we as an organization needed to identify the policy questions facing us about who we are and what we wanted to do as an organization, what we wanted to be doing in the future. So, and specifically, identifying those questions was also a way of helping to teach staff that we get input into a strategic plan, but key policy decisions get made by a governance structure, the board of directors. So by getting the staff very clear on 4 central questions the organization faced, was engaging them, getting them to identify their concerns, fears, the dilemmas that they saw, and then helping to educate them on what good governance is. And understanding that the board of directors plays a role and decides major policy questions facing the organization. And I think on the whole that was fairly successful. So we did that. We identified 4 questions. I'm not even sure I can remember what they are right now, but one had to do with our publishing division. One had to do with whether we were an association or a membership-driven organization. And those are very different, those means very different things for a national organization. Associations tend to be controlled by their membership. Boards get elected from the membership. Membership-driven usually is that members don't have a direct say in the governance of the organization. So very different things, and our staff was all over the place on this. A lot of our staff defined ourselves as an association. Others defined us as a think tank, and still others thought we should only be a publishing house, and others thought, okay, yeah, we're members, but we don't really listen to them, so what are we doing? So we went to the board. The board answers those questions in the best way, and then it influenced the adoption of some final goals and objectives. That was a long answer to your question. Yes?
What role did the members have when you were addressing these questions and going through this?
Robin, you want to try to answer that?
I just want to let everyone know who's targeting me because I'm the only staff person that's there at the time.
That's true.
There.
Amy and Kara were not there. That's right.
I think looking back on it, I think we did pull the membership, and we got some good feedback from the members, and I think we took it into account because the members felt as confused as the staff did. They weren't sure what our goals were as an organization. They weren't sure why they were members. They weren't sure what being a member meant. Like, what is the benefit of membership? So we've actually completely restructured our membership. It's in a different department. It's being looked at differently. We have increased membership benefits. I think they feel as if they have more of a say in what happens in an organization. So their input was as valuable as staff. It may not have influenced it quite as much, but it was valuable.
One of the things we learned was that what members wanted from our organization was completely different than what most of our staff thought we should be doing. It was a very, just like the organization was hierarchically driven by senior staff, the organization was assuming on its own, without a lot of independent feedback about what it should be doing for the field. Very dangerous, toxic mix. So the members told us they wanted more advocacy and public policy work from us. Well, the organization really hadn't invested in that in a serious way up until then. The membership also told us that, you know, they didn't like some of this programmatic work that we were doing that our staff held as sacrosanct. And we are still, to this day, struggling with that question because we're about to take a step forward in discontinuing some programs, and that is a big deal for some of our staff.
So one of the things you've tried to do is make create opportunities for staff to be more in direct touch, right? Members on a much more frequent and regular and systematic way,
Yep.
and to seek feedback more regularly, right? To become more customer oriented.
Absolutely. It's a good way of putting it. We're doing, I would say, the beginnings of the same process with our international partners. But that's really in its infancy because we've had an awful lot to attack domestically. But in the month of January, I went to Colombia and South Africa, where our organization has been working for many, many years, 40 years. And we sat down and did essentially a mini needs assessment and said, you know, what do you need and what do you think we can do for you? And I'm not really sure that's ever happened in a very objectively structured way with our international partners. So it was an amazing learning experience. So we're going to be doing things very differently internationally.
I saw so precious. Yeah.
So it sounds like you involved quite a few stakeholders in like designing this vision for where you thought the organization should go. Who did you involve when you were deciding how to get there and how you would actually implement these changes and what the steps would be? Was everyone involved in that as well, or was it more?
That's a really good question. So one of the goals of the process, of course, was to get to the stage where we identified our strategic, our dilemmas, our questions that the board needed to answer. Then we went to the board did that. They answered them to the best of their ability. And two, that then we took the input that came our way, and it was a small group of staff that came together to work on a draft set of goals and objectives. Those goals and objectives were sent back out to every staff member for comment. A lot of people didn't provide comment, but at least they had the opportunity to do so. We got some very good input, though, from selected divisions in the organization. Supervisors and staff were asked to discuss those goals and objectives with their teams for some input. And then that draft got presented to the board of directors. Board of directors made some minor tweaks and some things and approved it. Once it was approved, we took that plan and tried to operationalize it. So each division was asked to develop work plans that spoke to the strategic plan. The most difficult thing that we did was to try to come up with metrics that measured. And that's really hard stuff. We have been working under a set of metrics, and we've been diligently keeping those statistics during the last few years. But I think it's fair to say that I don't think we have that quite right yet. You know, you can collect a lot of metrics, but are they meaningful? Are they giving you the right information? Are you using those statistics in a way that guides your programming? And that's really an area that we still have a lot of work to do on. This strategic planning process that I described, we also did just ahead of the banking crisis and the recession. So it's a very different environment today. So we're actually starting a brand new strategic planning process later this spring, where I plan on instituting a modified process of what I just discussed. Again, starting with the staff up, identifying questions that need to be addressed, engaging the board. But I think this go around, we're going to try to do a much better job of accepting the realities of the environment we're operating in and understanding those data points and then feeding that into the process.
What we also, between executive leadership and board want to do is come up with an organizational evaluation policy, and an evaluation approach, not just for a single project or program, but across the organization. How many programs the organization gradually wants to sample, if you will, and then come to a first pilot or so of a significant program evaluation that is not for once, not driven by a donor who wants it, but because the organization wants to learn about it. So that's also at the beginning stages, and one of David's senior leaders is taking the lead in that and is consulting some of us in the board on that. So that we eventually, if we have a new strategic plan, and we have a sense of how we're going to evaluate the organizational level performance, not just the program level, but also the support services of the organization, right? And how do we assess ourselves against our values that we say we stand for? We will get some sense, in addition to the measures, indicators in the strategic plan, of whether the organization is making progress on the strategic directions that it sets.
Overall organizational effectiveness, you know, an evaluation that tries to get at that, this relates to a question I got asked a little earlier, is a newer area for nonprofits to really focus on, and it's pretty cutting edge. But it makes complete sense, of course. You know, how do you appropriately measure your organization's impact? You know, it's one thing to measure your individual programs, easier probably, but overall organizational impact, evaluating that in terms of trying to get at that question of whether we're effective or not, whether we're reducing, are we raising awareness of this issue? Is there more money getting allocated to solving this problem? Are the numbers of people with literacy problems in this country going down? You know, that's ultimately what we're trying to be able to measure, and it's complicated. I'm glad.
Especially also because of the attribution versus contribution issue. So what can ProLiteracy say eventually about whether it's contributed to a certain lowering of relative or absolute numbers?
Right.
And while keeping out all the other factors that are typically playing a role. It's very complicated methodological stuff.
Going to be very interesting. Yes.
Do you find that there is an appetite from donors to provide resources for things like an organizationally driven evaluation effort? Because yeah, I know that sort of effort probably takes a lot of resources. I've been in an organization where it takes investment, so how do you fund that?
Very good question. Tosca's going to answer this for us and come up with some money for us, I'm sure.
The latter. I would say that in general it's still quite difficult to get money specifically for that. On the one hand, there's a lot of discourse, not just amongst NGOs, but also in foundations about enhanced accountability. And so ProLiteracy will not be the only NGO that will say, well, if you want us to be more accountable, and not just to you for what is important to you, but also what is important to us as staff, and what is most important to our learners, our adult learners, then you need to also give us institutional core funding for that. There are some well-known NGOs who have had some success in that, but I think the donor discourse is still behind the donor practice of funding specifically that. So we're a little bit going out on a limb. But if we don't tell the donors that we're getting serious about this, and that we want money for it, then it will not happen.
There is, I think there's probably a dynamic tension and a set of dilemmas as you think about how to engage in this activity for your organization as a whole. There's no doubt that, you know, the donor community as a whole has changed a lot, particularly in this recession. They want to know where their dollars are going and what the impact of those dollars are. Now, donors, though, have a lot of different ideas about what they think constitutes impact or not. So how you mediate that, how you develop a general set of markers that everybody can buy into is a big dilemma, particularly when it comes to individual major donors that you may be working with. Institutional donors is a whole other category. I mean, institutional donors will usually have, and this is only increased with the federal government and with foundations, increase their evaluation criteria of the program they're funding. I don't have a lot of experience with federal funding sources or foundations who ask the larger evaluation questions about the organization's effectiveness as a whole, but I suspect it's coming. But so the dilemma there is that you have different evaluation criteria and methods that your funders want to see in place for your individual programs. And often the dollars do not flow in a way that's realistic to pay for that. So it's a dilemma.
Yeah, I'm just interested in, are you considering connecting the people you train with the job market, or have you ever done any evaluation on the impact of the training you have on their maybe ability to find a job?
Oh, that is the question of the moment. And I would say that in Washington, D.C., the question you just posed in terms of the dollars that get allocated to adult education, that is the question that's driving all policy considerations right now. Everything, and a lot of people in the education community resent this focus because they don't feel they should be evaluated solely on an ability to help someone find a job. Many others feel if it's not about getting a job, then what are you doing with these precious, limited public resources? So there's a huge tension and fight going on around that very question right now in Congress in the context of the renewal of a federal program called the Workforce Investment Act. Adult education is funded out of this federal program called the Workforce Investment Act. And as the bill is making its way through Congress, this is the major thing, the lens that people are viewing this through. There is some evaluation data that agencies keep that tracks what students are able to find a job and kind of ties it to educational gain measurements. But as a whole, this field is really bad at this stuff. And it's one of the big problems we're facing. So maybe you'd like to come work with us and solve that issue for us.
But it also depends on what segment of the learner market you serve, right? You want to say something about literacy and serving the lower end of the skill?
Yes.
And then what that means for getting a job.
Yeah.
So our agencies tend to serve, as I said in the beginning, the lowest literacy level adult. These are adults who, and families that are very marginalized in our society, have not only a range of educational needs, but a lot of other social problems they're dealing with. So working with a family or a young person within our system, it takes intensive efforts and a long time to gain those educational measurements so that they are proceeding on to more advanced education and then ultimately a job. This, though, is not recognized by most policymakers in Washington who want to see instantaneous results, of course. So that again is just a huge tension and dilemma for our field, particularly when it comes to the requirements of many of the funding sources. I'm curious to ask you guys, though, a little bit more about that question related to, leadership. What are the attributes that define successful leadership? What is leadership? I think is the question I want to pose. You're all studying this, right? What is leadership? I'm very curious in that question myself. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, maybe it's because I have seen a small movie about the Indian boy who is helping to move a tree in the street away. And suddenly all the adults follow him, like they're doing the things. So I think the leadership is a kind of you practice, you really do something that has an impact, and many people will follow you. Yeah, that's it.
Is it a set of intangibles, or can you quantify it?
I think it's one art. Yeah, you want
One art, you're saying?
Yeah, it's one art. You can quantify.
And an art is not definable.
Well, you can define depending on the situation you are, and yeah, I guess what you said might it's not an answer to your question. I guess there's no answer, but what you were talking about this stuff, I had a question. You were saying that low morale and all those budget issues. I just wonder, how did you get the staff to subscribe to the reforms you were doing, and what is the percent of the old stuff you still have and the new stuff?
Ooh.
Because for people it's hard to change, and you
Yes.
come with those ideas and with this new reality and oh, what this guy is doing,
I think we should ask.
You've posed a great question. I'm going to turn to our staff who may want to have a crack at answering that. Amy?
Well, I think your question is how our staff responded to the changes that we needed to make organizationally. And as you can probably imagine, there was this predated me, but I joined the organization about a year and a half ago, and some of the culture still remains that some resistance to the ideas.
But the good news is that there is definitely a critical mass, and I think once you reach that critical mass point, the tide begins to turn, and you do begin to make those cultural shifts and cultural changes that are inherent in making organizational change. So while I think there was some resistance and some residual resistance remains, we're beginning to get that critical mass of people who are ready to take the organization to the next level.
How did the critical mass get to that point, though? You or Robin or Kara?
I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in. I mean, let's,
New
you know,
staff, I think.
yeah, I
New
would,
staff.
New staff.
I think that's played a big part.
We have a lot of new staff.
So in other words, some people had to go and new people had to come with different ideas or maybe no presuppositions.
And line staff have been promoted. We've had a lot of promotions within our staff, which was also a key kind of management strategy. Help invest in people's future, help them to grow and learn in their jobs, which the organization had not been doing. Would you say, Robin?
I did 6 months of part-time consulting before I joined the board, and it was striking, since you already mentioned it, it was striking to me how overly mature this organization was, how almost, I would say, stagnant, if not in decline it was, amongst others because the leadership of all the major programs were indeed all white males, and they were all, had been in place for at least 20, sometimes 25, 30 years in that same leadership position. That cannot be right. That you have such a stagnation.
So a key strategy for any corporate entity, venture, organization of human institutions is they're living, human, breathing bodies, right? If you don't constantly change and innovate, just as you would in your personal life, you become stagnant and die. And so it's the same principle that I think you try to instill within an institution like ProLiteracy. And there's multiple strategies, I think, that we try to engage in to push ourselves forward in new ways. It's not a finished effort by any means, but I think that we have turned a very important corner, as Amy says, in terms of getting a critical mass that is really performing at a very high level, effectively, getting things done quickly and efficiently, taking on new ideas, implementing those new ideas to specific outcomes that you can really see and measure. And that's more, we have to do even more of that as we go forward.
So from an academic concept point of view, some of you have been in Catherine Gerard's leadership class, right? So she uses, one of her leadership terms she uses is symbolic leadership, which is the ability to have people follow you and the ability to influence the organizational culture, the values and the principles and philosophy of an organization. And I think that is one of the types of leadership that is necessary to come out of crisis. So symbolic leadership.
Personally, I don't have any easy answers to this either. But I think leadership is a complicated phenomena that is hard to describe sometimes. But there are tangible and intangible aspects to it. The intangible stuff comes from, what defines a charismatic person, a person who people like, they like being around, or they find funny, or they just get motivated by. What defines those sets of personal attributes? So understanding those personal attributes as part of leadership, I think, is very important. And then the more tangible stuff comes from the specific actions you take that might be informed by an overall framework. So strategic planning, staff structures, promoting individuals, moving some people out of the organization. These are important aspects of leadership as well. And an organization like ours needs it all.
Leadership, two types. Leadership with authority, leadership without authority. Leadership with authority, typically NGO or company CEO or politician. Without authority, civic movement. Good leader with authority will become more and more like good leaders without authority. the more and more influence, even if I don't influence beyond his authority, more and more influential beyond his authority. And leader without authority will become to leader with authority. You say oh, you should be a politician or something like that. So the exchangeable, so that
yes,
organization leader sometimes it's specifically extreme situation beyond the authority. Overstepping the authority is a very important for the leader. So yeah, two types, but always
they interplay.
Yeah, interplay.
That's a very important distinction, I think. Yes, and authority has to go along with leadership in order to make decisions and enact them. But ultimately, I think you're promoting leadership on the part of staff that may be more informal in nature, but it's things like self-initiation, carrying out a new project idea to completion, and doing that without the authority figure always telling you to do that. And maybe there are even certain circumstances where that's not necessarily sanctioned by the authority position, but it is, it's initiated by staff who feel free to do that, but also understand the parameters by which they can exercise that leadership. I appreciate that distinction. It's very good.
Any last questions or comments?
Yeah. Shouldn't leadership be the effectiveness or the success be judged or looked at as far as the when you leave a legacy, when a leader is there in the organization? I think it is not. It becomes biased in a certain way. The leader has leeway to take the organization in whichever direction that he or she wants to take. So the legacy, I think, is what defines leadership. When you're away, and if the staff still retain that vision of the leader, or if they still feel that the way the organization has changed, if that change is good and is something that needs to be carried forward.
I agree with you. That's effective leadership. When you've left a legacy and people retain what they've gained under a new operating system and they continue forward. However, I mean, another leader can come in and have a different vision, which might change the legacy of the previous leader. It'll reframe it. That's a better way of putting it. But I agree with you. I think that's a very interesting, important marker to look at in terms of effective leadership. What's the legacy?
We probably shouldn't think about too much about individual leadership versus shared leadership. You already said people need to feel empowered to be self-directed and so on. You talked about how you have moved up some of your line staff in a much more deliberate way, with the idea that even though you as a leader at some point will leave, yes, your legacy is important, but also your organization has to be able to go on without the singular leadership styles. Because otherwise we get the kind of founder types
mentality
of that we see in many.
That's the legacy I was talking about. Your idea, if it is propagated and practiced by somebody else, are a number of people in the organization.
Yeah, and when you use the word charism, I had to also think about what I thought about that.
Charisma?
Charisma, yeah. Yes, it's important, but if it's all hinging on your charism, it won't be sustained.
True.
So
True. So you need a lot of people with charisma. In your studies, have you studied specifically founders of organizations, their leadership styles, the legacy issues, all of that type of stuff? Have you guys gotten much into that? Founders? There's a whole specific dynamic around founders.
David, you know a lot about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole body of literature on founder syndrome. So what happens when a founder leaves or doesn't leave in time, and what that implies for the organization.
Having founded an organization myself, I lived this. And I think probably, to be really honest, it's a mixed thing. When I left the organization that I founded, it's very hard to confront and deal with issues of legacy and have you left an effective structure in place to continue after you. I took, interesting enough, you may know this, there's a course at the Annie E. Casey Foundation for founding executive directors of nonprofit institutions who want to leave their organizations. And I think it's like an 8-week course, and they put you through all kinds of things to think about how to manage that type of transition, which can often be very traumatic for an organization. And I don't know what the statistics are, but a lot of organizations fail after their founders leave. My organization didn't fail that I left, I'm proud to say.
Interestingly about ProLiteracy, the two founders of the two organizations that merged into ProLiteracy are still on our board.
95 years old.
95 years old. And I can testify as a co-board member that they have multiple kinds of influences, and I can't judge all of them. But in terms of what happens, the dynamics in the board, they do not have a negative impact on the board. They actually have learned how to reassess and redefine their position. And
It's somewhat remarkable.
It's very remarkable.
But that hasn't always been the case.
No,
To be honest about it. I mean, it's interesting. Our founders who are in their 90s now, you know, maybe it's fair to say that as you age, you may get a little less flexible. But what's fascinating to have watched with our founders is that I think their flexibility has increased by a sense of an understanding of these things. I would say that that was not really the case 10 to 15 years ago, when these two organizations were essentially family enterprises. You know, very much directed, led, personality imprint of the founders. So it's changed a lot, but very, I'm not sure I entirely understand what explains that success, but it happened.
It's remarkable.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, I think we need to bring it to a close. I want to thank you all of you for coming. I hope you signed up for our listserv if you weren't a member yet. And look for we will have our next speaker will be in April 18th. We will have Marshall Gans coming. He's a very well-known former community activist, then turned Harvard professor, who's a social movement specialist, and he'll talk about social movements as another part of civil society. He was also on the campaign for the first Obama campaign, and helped out with the mobilization of citizens there.
Can I come to that?
Yes, of course.
Okay, great.
He's not too happy about what happened to the legacy of his work in terms of citizen mobilization, but you'll have to ask him that.
Okay.
Thank you for coming, and thank you, David.
Thank you.